How often is it that a racing spin-off series completely overtakes its founding predecessor? I'd preface that apart from arguably the Forza Horizon series, this is an exceedingly uncommon practice. Unless, of course, we're talking about Grid. Race Driver Grid was a spiritual successor to Codemaster's historic Toka nameplate, which before the introduction of the aforementioned Grid spin-off, was Codemaster's shot at competing with the big dogs in the track racing niche. Unlike Gran Turismo or Forza Motorsport towards the end of Toka's run, these games would focus on proper homologated racing, and a more honed focus towards capturing the essence of real racing. The series had its strengths and plentiful fans, but was getting a bit long in the tooth, and so the team at Codemasters went to work, cooking up a racer which would keep some of the Toka game's finest strengths, yet balance that with a new direction, rivaling that of the 7th generation rivals. This would be Race Driver Grid. In the years surrounding Grid's release, Codemasters was entering what I like to think of as their golden era. The first Colin Mcrae Dirt had released the year before Grid. In 2009, they would begin their reign over the Formula 1 games, and release one of the greatest rally games ever made, Dirt 2. It's important that I contextualize this, because even in the midst of banger after banger release, if you're asking me, I can without a shadow of a doubt name Race Driver Grid as Codemaster's finest work. It took what they knew would be great, being the ego engine used in the development of the Dirt games, which, fun fact, is still being used to this day in F1 2024. There was also a new influx of road cars to go alongside the selection of homologated racing machines, to give the player a varied set of wheels to play around with. And arguably most important of all, this game would maintain a sense of aggression, grunge, and a huge emphasis on racing being a contact sport. What shows this off better than anything else is this game's stunning opening cutscene. It's undeniable that Grid is a knockout, gorgeous racing game, showing off its dramatic lighting and color tonality. But when the music, an absolutely badass remix of Queens of the Stone Age, kicks in, the crass side of racing is shown, perfectly balancing the duality of the clean exhilaration of motorsport, but not shying away from putting destruction, contact, and violence on full display. I want to stick on this for a while, as what struck me the most as I spend my hours in Grid is just how well this game's visual presentation has aged. Grid has vibes, real vibes. Not this whole nighttime low light scenarios where the ground is wet so the game looks better nonsense that you'll see with those Grand Theft Auto 5 graphic mods, or god forbid, Need for Speed 2015. This game has real vibes because of carefully orchestrated design. Games like Silent Hill 2 or Persona 5 emblematize this perfectly. It's through cohesive design, creative art direction, and smart utilization of your hardware that will allow you to create art direction which will stand the test of time, even if its raw fidelity won't. This principle rarely applies to racing games, but Grid does this masterfully. Let's take a look at your garage as an example here. Ignoring the menus for a moment, strictly focusing on the background, you get a simple in-engine playback of your racing team's garage. But it's a little more than that. The lighting is very carefully placed to emphasize the rays pouring into and filling the room. It's very dramatic without being overindulgent. And now with the menus themselves, it all revolves around three-dimensional text models which will move and transition seamlessly through camera switches, or choosing another option in the menu. This would have been so much more effort than simple static menus, but Codemasters wasn't the type to be simple. Hell, even the licensing agreement buried in the menus is rendered in a 3D model. It's so unnecessary, but very well appreciated. Oh, and it helps that the narrator calls me such a sweet nickname as well.
Hello, dump truck.
This excellence in presentation only continues when you get into the game. Many games of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 era love to use this grimy light brown and dull grayish successor to the love it or hate it piss filter, which games such as Need for Speed Most Wanted are notorious for. Grid is no exception to this, but it's one of very few games that I believe honestly use this grungy color tonality to enhance its visuals without dating the game too strongly. This is mainly due to the fact that, well, it's used quite sparingly in comparison to some of the more excessive executions of this filtered style. Grid also leads into a far less saturated, but more punchier in contrast style as its visual basis. And underneath all of that is a game that before any sort of post-processing effects, plain looks good even in the modern day. Art direction is once again the key here. I still lose myself driving down the streets approaching the Milan Cathedral, and then watching the light rays pierce through the shadowed alleyway just past. When racing in Shibuya, the asphalt mirroring the skyscraper's lights, and neon rays at dawn, painted underneath the superfluous shop lights and overhead bridges that thrive at the call of midnight. The sheer density of crowds in the grandstands or trackside streets. I'd make the claim that approaching 17 years since release, it is visually aged better than any racing game before 2010, and even then, it's still in the running for one of the best looking 7th generation racing games. For the sake of example, looking at Need for Speed Undercover, which released in the same year, that game relied far too heavily on filters and overblown bloom effects which didn't look good in 2008, let alone in the modern day. All of this without mentioning the more technical feats which help lift up the grungy, fists-out tone. The damage model, for instance, starting from a strictly visual perspective. This level of deformation, damage, and defilement simply remains unmatched in track racers over 15 years post-release. Take a look at this Sora, for instance. The whole chassis of the car has been given an hourglass figure even Marilyn Monroe would be jealous of. The passenger door crumpled so far in, the base is nearly at the center console. The rear wheels camber a near perfect replica of those Bosuzoku builds. All of this would have taken an extraordinary amount of development resources, hence why I believe this game's car list is so short. The damage model is enhanced directly through gameplay. All of those visual deformations on the Sora demonstration I showed earlier directly correlate to your car's behavior. Bend your chassis or set an axle off balance? Well, your car's gonna start dog tracking instead of following an aligned path. Hit your front end hard enough to damage your engine and transmission and, well, you'll be slow on the straights. Grid is the perfect example of applying thematic overlap through gameplay. That same clean and dirty racing balance shown off through the introductory cinematic is shown to you inadvertently through how you respond to in-race contact. Will you back off a tightly packed corner to play it safe? Or go for that gap, knowing damn well you could get turned into, and at the very least, knock a wheel off alignment for the rest of the race? The last piece of the damage puzzle worth touching on is how Race Driver Grid handles recovery. Based on the difficulty that you select, you can either race raw and have every piece of contact count, so that if you have a large accident, it's over. Or you can have a selection of rewind options. This isn't just one of the early pioneers of rewind systems in racing games. It's damn near the best at it. Rewind has become somewhat of a formality in games such as Forza Horizon and Motorsport. You can use it as many times as you'd like, and yet you're also limited to extremely specific points where you can resume your gameplay, which often blummin' suck. In Grid, you have a limited usage of your rewind ability, most commonly 4 per race on standard difficulty. This lets you add a little bit of strategy while also allowing for a slight safety net so you don't jeopardize your race. Oh, and the pool of rewind time that you're given may be limited, but you can pick up and play from any spot within it. 16 years old, and still the best rewind system in a racing game. Checkmate. One final atmospheric tool that's used exceptionally well in Grid is audio design. The race director, who keeps you on date with your teammate, your current position, and if there's been an accident. The crowds that audibly scream when you collide into a barrier nearby them. The roaring of engines and transmissions. And this is all without mentioning the music. Grid has by far some of the best compositions put into a racing game. Many of the tracks here feel straight out of an action movie, and act like it too. This is one of the only racing games to have fully dynamic music. When you're in the heat of a race, the music is intense. If you get into first position, the music mellows, in an effort to give you a false sense of comfort and security. On the final lap, the same track that's playing will go rampant in intensity, hiding the climactic end of the race. It's very dramatic, but knows how to mellow out as well when you're just in the garage chilling out. My favorite little touch in this soundtrack is on Razor's Edge, where in the beginning of the song designed for the start of a race, they incorporate torque wrenches into the percussion to add to the pre-race atmosphere. This game is sick, dude. Now, it should be pretty clear by now that through its visuals and presentation alone, Grid has held up fantastically well for a game so old it could get its own driver's license. But looks alone are one thing. They don't mean much if trying to play the game feels like wrangling with an alligator when you're trying to just steer cars around a racetrack. Thankfully, throughout my hours spent in Grid, I constantly kept questioning just how good this felt. Let's start with the most important part of any track racer, the driving and physics. The word that kept coming to me the more I drove the streets and tracks of Grid is fluid, and I mean that to the truest sense of the word. There's a certain flow and waft to how your car takes a corner. You'll never feel as if steering quickly is necessarily sharp, but there is that flow to it which may take a little while to get used to. But once you do, you'll realize just how unstoppable you can become. As a caveat to this, I wanted to touch on the driving assists. I tend to prefer driving in racing games with every assist off except for ABS the majority of the time. It gives me a baseline to give each physics model a crack and see what happens when you push past the limits of artificial assistance. And in most racing games, traction and stability control serve simply to help elevate those who may not be as experienced with throttle control, weight transfer, or smooth cornering techniques. This in turn doesn't really make you all that much quicker, but helps to bring players in a more level playing field, with a definite slight edge still going to those who can still play without assists, which can take full advantage of their skill set. And that I'm in full support of. In Grid, however, playing with assists on is quite frankly like activating God mode. All of a sudden, the physics model feels entirely different, and you can well and truly use the good old-fashioned when in doubt flat out mentality, just full sending it all over the track. It's an honestly beautiful balance of allowing you to feel right at the limit, enhancing your driving ability and showing off how weight transfer affects your vehicle, albeit to a very fictitious degree. On the flip side though, when you're playing without traction and stability control on, I'll be honest, I really don't like how Grid plays with assists off. This is an arcade game after all, and the physics model fully relies on player confidence, and the ability to be a bit rougher with your car than most other racing games, as the flowy, fluid nature of body roll and weight transfer will enhance your line through corners. With those assists off, that level of confidence is simply not there. Cars become disheveled and almost unwieldy because that level of grip is so much lower than with assists. This might be the first time I ever recommend playing a racing game with the assists on. It's so hard to demonstrate without actually letting you experience it for yourself. So if you decide to play Grid, keep that traction and stability control on. I promise you, it is far more enjoyable. With the assists out of the way, I want to wrap up on the physics by stating just how good they still feel. Most of the times, when you go back and play racing games from the same generation, you'll have a great time with how the cars feel, but they don't particularly feel all that modern or have realistic mannerisms. Take Undercover or Midnight Club LA as examples of this. Or for a more apt comparison, the prior year's Need for Speed Pro Street. Don't get me wrong, I am a big Pro Street enjoyer, but it feels almost archaic in comparison. This game feels so good to drive in, and I do not exaggerate when I say that this very well may be one of my favorite physics models in an arcade circuit racer. Alright, so the cars handle well. Good, that's a priority. So what about the selection and offer here? What cars can we drive and what can you do with them? There are a total of 43 vehicles to drive throughout your save, which in all honesty isn't that small of a number. Though I will say that due to how the campaign is structured, I didn't find myself using all that many of them, but we'll get to that in a bit. This was a fair bit smaller of a list than the previous Toka Race Driver entries, but as I said earlier, this primarily comes down to the fact that a good chunk of this game's list being licensed cars. To go alongside this, the intense effort required to have working damage models for each and every car meant that this list couldn't rival the likes of the most recent Forza, that being Motorsport 2's whopping 349 strong list. That is a pretty substantial difference. Though I will admit, there are some pretty banging rides here. The Mazda Furai, Panos Esperante, and Mustang GTR concept as examples here. The DLC had some great additions as well, such as the Bugatti Veyron and Volkswagen Nardo, though unfortunately, you can't really use them in the campaign, so they're limited to race days. Now, in comparison to many of its contemporaries, Grid also severely lacked interaction within its cars, stripping any sort of performance modifications or tunability from the garage, meaning that the only thing that you could do with your vehicles in Grid is paint them towards your team livery. I mean, come on, Pro Street had not only crazy visual customization with auto sculpt and its body kits, but the disciplines that you could tune and upgrade your cars for. But I'll be honest, I don't really care. This very clearly was going for a different motive to that of its competitors. Grid was about capturing the spirit and adrenaline of race day atmosphere, and combining that with other mechanics which I'll touch on in the campaign segment. What I've said so far about Grid's vehicles mirrors near perfectly how I feel about its track list. Just about the worst thing that I can say about them is that, well, there isn't that many, with about 15 locales in total when you include DLC. Now yes, I will say that this became really noticeable during the career, especially when I got closer to the end. It only feels as if I'm racing on 5 or 6 of them. But the quality of tracks, that's top notch. There is not a single track here that I load into and go, man, I really don't want to be racing here. The circuits on offer are quite unique as well, having a mix of both fictional street tracks taking place in real-life locations, such as Milan, Washington, San Francisco, or Shibuya, and then mixing in real-life circuits such as Spa-Francorchamps, Jarama, Donington Park, and the Nürburgring GP. The level of detail is quite different to that of what a sim racer would target. It's less about capturing the most authentic laser-scanned perfect replica of real life. What Grid targets is building the atmosphere and enhancing a track's most prominent attributes. My favorite part of Grid's track list, though, is when I'm racing on tracks conjured up by Codemasters themselves. The mountains of Japan, drifting or racing down tight, curvy mountain roads, with stunning views off the cliffs. Racing down the streets of DC and watching as the colossal Washington Monument comes into view. The aforementioned cathedral in the streets of Milan. I have always been a proponent of fictional tracks in racing games, and it's for this very reason. You get the chance to warp a real-life location, landmarks, and its perceived characteristics to a vastly more dramatized state where it almost feels straight out of fiction, and that's because it's been enhanced to a level that it pretty much is. The setup so far for Grid's gameplay is solid. Sure, it may not be the most content-dense racer, but it's clear that that's not the target of this game, and nothing shows that better than what I experienced in this career. Before venturing into Grid for this retrospective, I had heard ad nauseum about how this game is one of the most innovative and unique campaigns ever put into a racing game. If you've been watching me for a while, you know just how much having a solid, creative single-player component means to me. So for someone playing this game for the first time as the clock turns to 2025, just how true is this? Well, for the most part, I'd say, yes, this rings true. Race Driver Grid does stand out with some genuinely interesting mechanics and strategy, which do nothing but elevate the game. But I'd also be lying if I said that this experience was flawless. So let's dissect it. The opening to this game is very strong. You get a neat pre-rendered CG sequence, zooming into one of the game's most iconic tracks, San Francisco, as you get tossed into the cover Viper for your very first on-track shakedown. It does a fantastic job of showing off the best parts of Grid without throwing team mechanics at you right away, simply letting you soak in the atmosphere and how this game will play more than anything. This introductory race lets you have a taste of what it's like to be a racing driver in an invitational event, as after all, you're just a newbie who doesn't have a reputation behind your name, though this campaign is all about changing that. After the introductory race, you'll get sent to the garage, where it's time to build your own racing team. Now these days, Codemasters is pretty well known for having great team-based racing games. Take a look at the F1 series, for example. Though the structure of all of this started right here with Grid. Things start out pretty slow. You get to choose the colors, livery, and sponsors for your team, which will give you certain objectives that you'll have to target in order to get some good bonus cash. And cash you'll need, as you start off with empty hands, having to rely mostly on invitationals to begin with. For the majority of the game, you'll be racing in 3 separate regions in order to level up your reputations in America, Europe, and Japan. The event styles do tend to differentiate between each region, so in America you'll do anything from standard circuit racing to full-on demolition derby. Europe is pretty cut and dry most of the time, primarily focused on circuit racing, and to finish off, Japan loves to throw some drifting and Toge Canyon runs into the mix. I will say that while there is a decent amount of variety in event types here, they're not really all that well utilized. At the start of the game, you are constantly doing new things, doing races and then derbies and then chucking it sideways. But as your career goes on, things really start to streamline themselves and become more focused on just racing. I suppose thematically that does make sense, with your team developing a far stronger reputation, hence leading to more professional race events. But this is a video game after all, and I do wish that same level of variety continued going into the late game. There is something to be said about the implementation of some of these as well, and that's mostly regarding difficulty. I think Demolition Derby is the only one that I found to be balanced really quite well, as you more than ever have to pay attention and avoid contact while also maintaining pace so you can win these races. The standard circuit events are, for the most part, fine, albeit certainly on the easy side, but the drift events here, I genuinely believe that a blindfolded baby could ace these without an ounce of trouble. I've had no problem getting well over 1 or 2 million points in comparison to the AI who will barely crack into the 6 figures. So while yes, the drift physics are really quite fun and the mechanics of getting close to cones for a bonus are really quite neat, the fact that there is zero challenge negates almost all of the joy found here. I've been relatively critical of Grid's career so far, as I've been viewing it from the perspective of a typical racing game. But there is a huge boon for this career that I cannot simply gloss over, and it's the team play. Once you've progressed far enough into your campaign, you'll unlock the ability to hire a second driver for your team. You can choose a teammate based on budget, skill level, their specialties. It's a super neat feature. This isn't just for show either. As well, yes, some higher skilled teammates, for example, can take a larger cut of your winnings. The plus side is that they can consistently bring in bonus sponsor money to balance that out. Strategy is the name of the game here, and it's not just through teammates. Want to save some money when entering a new league? Instead of buying a brand new car for your team with nothing on the odometer, hop onto eBay Motors and pick up a used one for a fair discount, which you can then use towards a better teammate or save for another discipline. There's a beautiful level of interaction and personalization in each campaign here, as my run will almost certainly be different to many others. Some may rely strictly on invitationals rather than sponsors to build money for their team. Some will cheap out on a teammate in order to afford better cars. Some will get a cheaper car and a more expensive teammate. The dynamic side of this campaign is so cool. Something else I wanted to mention is the mid-season interjections, typically in the form of an invitational Le Mans race. These are fun. They function as a sped-up 24 hours of Le Mans, complete with a full day, midday, and night cycle. The only events in the game to feature this. The best part? Totally optional. They exist primarily as a boost if you want a large influx of cash and rep mid-season. One of the earliest Le Mans events also features one of my favorite fun facts about this game, based on the 996 Porsche RSR. Most of you are aware of Porsche and EA's exclusivity deal, which prevented Porsche models from showing up in any racing game apart from Need for Speed. Grid was able to bypass this in a pretty cheeky way. This car can only be used in these invitational events. It cannot be purchased through the car list, and can only be used in very specific Porsche-approved liveries, rather than your team liveries. It's a small thing in the grand scale of the game as a whole, but it's a story that I just find so fascinating. Now, while there's plenty of depth to how you navigate throughout Grid's campaign, and undoubtedly that's the best part about it, I got the same feeling that I did in Need for Speed Pro Street. Whereas once you pass about the 80% completion mark, it does feel like things start to drag on for a bit longer than they should. Races get longer, they aren't as varied, championships get longer, but in turn, the difficulty raises. So you trade a bit of that traditional fun factor for challenge. As you approach the final climax of this story, I also found this to be a bit underwhelming. You see, throughout the game, similar to how those Le Mans intermissions would pop up, so would head-to-heads, which would pit you against a rival from another team to face off in an event or two. This exact thing happens for the final race, but there's no real build-up, no dialogue. I didn't even know this would happen. It just pops up when you win each one of the final championships, and then boom, you're off to the races. Once you're across the line as well, you get a simple message from your engineer, and boom, the credits roll. Now, it isn't a deal breaker at all, but for a game which is so heavily structured around this career mode, it feels like a major missed opportunity not to make this feel weighty and act as a proper conclusion for your time with Grid. Though as much as I feel this conclusion itself is relatively underwhelming, I think it's pretty wicked that for the final race, you're locked into extreme difficulty and only have a single rewind to use throughout 3 laps of Le Mans. So think of this less as a conclusion to Grid, but a final test. As the credits roll, I love the fact that Cody's tossed in a bunch of photos from the staff behind the game. This end product truly and utterly feels like a labor of love. A project is only as good as the team behind it, and to the visionaries at Codemasters who poured their soul into this game, it shows. And I'm glad that you all are proud of this game, because you should be. A passion project, this game sure is. And honestly, no matter how many times that I saw this game recommended to me by you guys, I didn't think it would live up to the hype. But I'm very happy to admit defeat here. Grid has quite definitively become my all-time favorite Codemasters racing game, and entered my upper echelon of track racers. This game has aged so well, and if you're like me and missed out on this original Grid experience, I strongly recommend you give Race Driver Grid a shot. It may well win you over as much as it did me. Now quickly, as we end this video, I want to share some pretty incredible news with you all. Thanks to your unwavering and passionate support of the channel, we have just crossed 40,000 subscribers. I am ever so grateful for your support in the past year. It's been a hell of a ride, And to thank you all, I wanted to reiterate what I mentioned in the recent channel update, and that's that I will be hosting a Q&A where I'll be on camera answering your questions. If you'd like to join in, leave a comment down below stating that you'd like to be in the Q&A. Leave your question for me in the same comment, and let me know if you'd like to remain anonymous with your question. Now, I can't give you a date as to when this will be, as the next month is looking pretty turbulent for me, but don't worry. It'll happen. If you like this video and want to stick with me on the grid journey, leave a like on the video and hit that subscribe button if you want to be here as we venture into each forthcoming game. Thank you guys so much for your incredible support, and the next time that I see you all, we'll be diving deep into Grid 2. Stay safe, stay awesome, and I'll see you all then.